Welcome to episode 72 of In Bed with Books. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my previous reads over the last few months, some of the books I've reviewed. I'm trying to get into a better habit of reviewing my books, partially because I realized that I read quite a bit and I don't have a solid record of what I've read, and I love having records of things. So in the interest of accountability on that, I'm going to try to do these little video vlogs, review vlogs to make up for that. But also, if you'd like to see more fleshed out versions of these reviews, then definitely check out my Storygraph or my Goodreads accounts. These are the ones that I've definitely tried to add long reviews for in Storygraph and Goodreads, so you can find a little bit more about my thoughts on these books there. And then I'm not going to talk about these in reading order because I tend to read multiple books at once. Sorry, I've got Jake on my lap right now. And so that is why I'm only talking with one hand. I'm gonna go through it's probably more, I don't know, scandalous, but I'm gonna go through from order of my most favorite to my least favorite reads. There's only a few books here, not all from the beginning of this year, but I will stop rambling and just get into it. So the only 5-star read that I've got for the last probably 8 or 9 months, actually probably in the last year, is The Scarlet Veil by Shelby Mahurin. So this was a sequel series that focused on Saley, and Saley was certainly not my favorite character in Serpent and Dove. However, she definitely surprised me in this book. I went into this thinking, okay, Saley is not my favorite character from Serpent and Dove, but I really, really like vampires, so I'm willing to read this book that is about a character that I really couldn't care less about. By the end of this book, I was definitely, my tone had definitely changed on Saley. Having her point of view obviously was instrumental in that, but also, it was just a really solid plot. The little investigating that she's doing, and I say little, but it's kind of grave robbing and kind of zombies, and it really it was its own thing from Serpent and Dove, which I really enjoyed. I think that when you have a sequel series, you can sometimes run into the issue of trying to just recreate what worked well the first time, but that's Mahurin does not fall into that pit, I guess. I also really like the slow burn between Saley and Michael, and I'm a big fan of slow burn, so it doesn't take much, but I guess I just liked the slow burn. It's one of my favorite tropes, so it was really fun to get to do that, especially I don't want to compare apples and oranges too much, but Saley and Michael versus Lou and Reed. Lou and Reed is a slow burn in that kind of, but in that Lou is a witch and Reed is at the church, and so there's this kind of, they shouldn't be together, but they are. But Michael and Saley's slow burn it's just because she's already engaged, who I will get into that in a moment, but it's just really, it's hot, it's sweet, they challenge each other in a lot of ways, which I really enjoy, which I guess kind of leads me into my one big negative for this, which is how much I hated Jean-Luc. And I understand that we're not supposed to like him, I definitely get that. However, it was sometimes just intolerable. listening to Saley talk about Jean-Luc, because at no point did he say or do anything that made me like him. There's no point when he's saying something when I'm like, no, I can understand, I guess, where he's coming from. Like, Saley's internal monologue felt like we were supposed to care, or like we were supposed to have some sort of sympathy for him, but honestly at no point did I feel any kind of sympathy for him, to the point where, like, when he was having his tantrum on the docks, I felt just like secondhand embarrassment. I I nearly skipped that part, except for the fact that her and Michael were like basically touching. But I will say, so if you listened to the previous episode with me and Kristen, you kind of heard me talk about this, because Jean-Luc just like coddles her. And so I think that's part of the reason that like the dynamic between her and Michael is so refreshing, because he, like, both of them with each other, like her to him, her to Michael, and then Michael to Saley, they're like intellectually challenging each other, and it just makes it makes it really satisfying when she's being respected in a way that, like, even some of the group, like some of the original group from Serpent and Dove, don't treat her that kindly. Okay, well, that's my thoughts on that. So I think so far I'm good on time. Okay, so for my 4-star reads, I'm including like my 4.5 stars, whatever. For my first of the 4-star reads is Chalice of the Gods by Rick Riordan. This was one of my nostalgia reads for the new year. I rated this one a 4.5 because it really, like, the reason I was reading it was because I was trying to, like, dip back into the Percy Jackson series and into the universe. And just, like, a little inner child stuff, you know, starting Saturn Return, returning to those things that, like, helped shape me into who I am. And in that respect, it hit everything that I needed. So it's like Percy is, you know, older, he's in high school at this point, he's trying to get into college, and I liked that the stakes weren't like life-threatening or world-ending. It's not like he's trying to fight Kronos or Gaia or whatever. So in that respect, it was like almost kind of cozy. It felt kind of like less big, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, I definitely enjoyed that coming back into it because of me wanting to read this as like a feel-good read more than anything. Part of the reason that I enjoy that as well is because I wouldn't want it to be just like every conflict has to get bigger. If every conflict has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, it's just like, what are we doing here, first of all? Second of all, it's just not sustainable. Like, at some point, you're gonna watch it crash and burn. And I think, like, there's a lot of things now doing that, and there's definitely a book that I'm going to talk about that I think is falling into that trap. But it's like the Marvel trap, where they did all of this stuff leading up to Infinity War, and now they think they have to keep making it bigger and bigger, and things are just like falling apart. And it really sucks, because you enjoy the characters and then they get just like ruined by the like terrible storytelling. So the reason though that I wouldn't rate this a 5-star read, and this is entirely on me, this is not like a fault with the book, is that I have to remind myself that this is a book written for like middle grade kids, maybe a little higher since Percy's supposed to be going into college, I don't know, but it's definitely not like late 20s, early 30s, like my usual grade of books, because so much of the like the lessons in this are just really spoon-fed, and I don't hate that entirely. Again, I recognize that is entirely a product of what I'm reading and not necessarily like a fault with the book. But like, it definitely reminded me of the fact that I was reading like a middle-aged book, and I needed to afterwards I had to read more adult books to move past that, because it's being spoon-fed isn't all that fun. In some cases it does end up feeling like info dumping, which sucks. But that being said, I think so, like, the main lessons from this book, I should probably mention there's definitely gonna be spoilers in this. I will put that down in the description. But the main lessons from this first one, because I think it is going to be like a few books in this series while he's trying to get all of his letters of recommendation, is to, like, not be afraid of aging, which was fun to read about as somebody who's reading this, trying to, you know, like, inner child, like, nostalgia read, turning 30 soon. And so it was definitely like a good book, I think, for me to jump back in at this age. So I in that respect, I really enjoyed this book. So again, 4.5 stars. Loved it. My next 4-star read, official 4-star read in recent reads, is Sanctuary of the Shadow by Aurora Ascher. I actually had the author on the podcast a couple of episodes back, and it was a blast. I really, really enjoyed this book. The main reason, or I guess like the number one reason I should say, is the smut. It was so hot. It was just beyond hot sex. The dynamic between Harrow and Wraith is really, really, it's really emotional, and it was a emotionally taxing in kind of the best way kind of book. So I really liked that aspect of it. And then I liked the found family aspect of this as well, which played a really huge role. At first, I mean, it was obvious because it's kind of talked about in the blurb and everything, but the influence that the found family has over the plot, I think, was choice. I liked it a lot. I liked Malika. Even I can't remember his name, but the guy who runs the circus, he kind of anti-hero, kind of hot. Like, he wants to protect his girls, but also he's kind of doing terrible things to do it. And I like that. I'm not going to deny that. And then there's the snake shapeshifter, who, I guess not shapeshifter, but the snake hybrid, who's also leading a gang, just happily in there, like, hot as fuck. I really forgot how much I really like snake hybrid or snake shifters. But I'm praying that is who Malika gets with in the next book, because we do have confirmation that it is Malika who's the focus in book 2. Two of my big qualms with this, one of them much smaller than the other, but the first one is that the queen's motivation, I guess, like the water queen, her flip-flopping on helping Harrow, I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it when she helped her, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, like, I didn't trust her. Not that I think the queen has to be trustworthy, but just that, like, so much of her, like, decision to do so and, like, the motivating factor behind it happens behind the scenes. And so when it came time for her to actually help, I just fully didn't believe or buy that that's what was happening. Yeah, so that was a big, like, hang up that I had, but I wouldn't say that it obstructed my experience of the reading. It definitely just was a hang up that I had. The other one, and I think I've talked about this in the podcast before, is that I'm not a fan of pregnancy trope. Although this time I'm hesitant to call it a trope, just because it doesn't necessarily happen a lot in the book. It happens mostly at the very end, like the very end of the last chapter, and then the epilogue. There was a lot of detail that was given about the pregnancy itself, and a lot of excitement, and so it wasn't like it was a pregnancy trope in that, like, it's the core plot of the book, and so that's why I'm kind of like, it's a smaller qualm that I've got with it. And it also just makes me more excited for the next book, because I know the next book is going to have more hot sex between somebody else and not between like somebody who's lactating. So that'll be nice. The next 4-star reads, and this one's more of like a duo because I shot through the two of them so fast together that they kind of blend in my head, and I don't want to I can't physically separate them now. But it's the X-Hex and the Kiss Curse by Erin Sterling. This is from the Graves Glen series, and I think it's meant to be a trilogy, if I'm not mistaken. That's the last I read. These were just like a nice cozy read. It had some like a couple of quality sex scenes in each of them. It's definitely one of those books, and I will say, like, Sanctuary of the Shadow, you see the sex every single time, just about. Like, anytime she can show you the sex, she is showing you the sex, which I appreciated. X-Hex and Kiss Curse, they have sex the first time, and we might see it a couple of times after that. But really, once they have sex the first time, we're not getting those scenes, which I had some issue with. But they're still really cozy, and I think a lot of that has more to do with like the various aesthetic vibes that Sterling was throwing in there. So she's got like the small town, Gilmore Girlsy, and then small family. You got kind of like the practical magic side of it. There's some like light academia mixed in with some like dark academia because of the way the university functions. And then you've got like the shopkeeper versus the barkeeper. You've got some like previously scorned lovers versus like the enemies to lovers. It's a lot of like really just comforting vibes. And I think that is because it's first and foremost like a romance versus like fantasy. Like I would probably call this just like a romance book, both of these books, more than like a fantasy romance, even though it's got a fantasy element. Because it follows just like a very traditional romance structure. And I don't mean that as an insult. It's very much just like, you know, it's comforting in the same way that watching your favorite rom-com is comforting. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think it's like there's merit to just like reading because you know how it's going to end. You know that they're going to get together in the end, and just being excited to go along for the ride to figure out how they get there. Because I'm talking about two books, I do want to say as well that like, even though I'm blending events in my head because I read them so fast back to back, each couple was definitely distinct in their dynamic, and then also like in their journey from conflict to strangers to kind of friends to definite lovers. I don't think that even though, because you've got like the cousins that are together with the brothers, and you've got the opportunity for this to be very cookie cutter between the two of them, and it's not. Even though they're both in their own way kind of distinct enemies to lovers, they are like, they've got their own special flavor, which I really appreciated. I was looking it up, and from what I can tell, the next book is not about one of the Jones women, and I'm kind of bothered by that, only because the whole like point of books 1 and 2 is that the women are kind of the real focus of Graves Glen. Their ancestors' magic is the magic that helped found the city, and like, okay, again, spoiler. Gwyn is so strong that she's able to overpower, like, basically having her magic stolen because she just believes she can, which I've got some issue with in terms of, like, world building, but also, like, if I were just to take this at face value of powerful women run this town, which I love, I'm here for it, then I feel like the next focus shouldn't be the third Penhallow brother, but, like, the aunt, or I don't know, like somebody else related to the cousins to the Jones women. That's just a qualm that I've got, because then it really just, when you have it focus on the next brother, it really centralizes them in the story, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. I'm probably still gonna read it, and then I'll decide how I feel about it. But yeah, so that's kind of a weird qualm for me that I'm like rating lower than usual, just because I haven't read the book yet. It's more just anticipation for me. But then a weird nitpicky thing on my end is that the shop that they run is like a tourist trap, and they're like supposed to be real witches, but they're just selling like plastic trinkets and things that like kind of like one use things. And if they are supposed to be these like all powerful witches, then why are they selling crap? I don't know. It just really bothered me because it's like, it's not sustainable. Like literal like things being sustainable, like selling plastic things that just somebody's going to throw out after they leave Gravesglen is not like environmentally friendly. And if there's one thing I know about witches from reading about them all the time, it's that they would 100% do things that are supposed to be environmentally friendly. So yeah, that was like a qualm of mine, especially because like the conflict between Gwen and Wells in the second book is that he decides to open up a second shop that sells like better quality stuff. And I'm fully on board for it. Like, I kind of wish that his shop had just beaten out her shop and they'd moved over there, because the way that they describe the Joneses store just feels more like a glorified Spirit Halloween. And I don't know how much more glorified, if I'm being totally honest. Like, in my head, it just felt like we were walking through Spirit Halloween without the costumes. So that was, in some ways, it just kind of pulled me out of like believing in the sisters being as powerful as they are. But yeah, that's just my opinion. I don't know if I'm alone in that or not. But now I'm going to talk about some of my least favorite, I shouldn't say least favorite. I'm underselling it a little bit. My lower rated reads, some of which were a surprise. So I will jump into the first one. Another, in conjunction with like my other nostalgia reads, has been reading through the Hollow series, which you can see right there. So I just read the third one in the series, which is Every Which Way But Dead, authored by Kim Harrison. Big fan of these books, and I've read through, I want to say all of them, but as I'm reading through, I'm realizing I probably skipped a few, because what I thought were events happening throughout the series are kind of just happening all at the beginning here. I rated this one 3.5 stars. My biggest qualm with this, and I'll say the qualm first just because it kind of puts context to something else that I actually liked about the book. My biggest qualm with this is that there's not a case that she's working on, and that really, really screws with the pacing, I think, because usually she's working on a case, and even though kind of like bigger plot things, kind of like, you know, full series plot things are happening in between case, like book specific plot things, the case helps push along the plot within, like, or like between chapters. Because there's like this rule in theater where it's like you walk with purpose when you go on stage. Like when you're walking on stage, even though you're walking on to go speak to somebody and like say something, your character might have to pretend that they're doing something else so that it makes sense. You're not just walking on stage randomly. And I think that was kind of the issue that this book had, which is that like a chapter would start and she'd just basically be like in the middle of doing like mundane things. And then plot would kind of just like stumble upon her. Whereas usually she's like, okay, I'm getting ready to do this thing, and she does the thing, but in the process of doing the thing, also more plot happens. And that, I think, keeps it rolling a lot easier. That being said, because there wasn't a case to work on, because it was mostly character driven, like by the characters around her, it was much more, the development was much more fleshed out than I think it has been in the previous couple of books. And I think that makes it, I like that aspect of it, because sometimes she gets so caught up in everything happening that she's like, Rachel, the main character, is very much like, I do not have time to think about that right now. I am gonna just bookmark that for later. And then now in this book is very much like the later of that happening. I, again, having like read most of, if not all of the series before, I was kind of like, I'm constantly thinking as I'm reading through these, like, oh my god, I forgot how she was in the beginning. Because it's such like, in the very beginning, she's so like white magic, earth magic, no ley lines, no dark curses. But then later in the series, she's like, well, it's only a dark curse because of this. It's actually not that much smut, and it's not because you're gonna go, to hell or whatever. And so she gets so much more loosey-goosey later on. And the first, like, 2.5 books reading this, I'm like, she's so strict with this about herself that I really needed this book to help push that forward, to help me even believe that it wasn't just, like, a light switch that went on, but, like, to see the gradual progression. So even though it kind of screwed up the pacing, I think having the ability for it to be more character, like, development focused made a big difference in, like, her progress throughout the series. So I enjoyed that. But I still rated it 3.5 stars because it was one of the harder ones that I've had to get through recently. But pacing does tend to be an issue with the 3-star reads that I've got here. Okay, I kind of want to save this one for last, even though... Okay, I'm going to save this one for last, and you can probably guess which one it is if you've been listening to the podcast for a while. So next on our list is Fragile Threads of Power. This is a sequel series to Darker Shades of Magic, which I really enjoyed. I really, really enjoyed the first series for this, trilogy for this, and so it really broke my heart to rate this 3 stars. For context, I will rarely go below 3 stars. Like, a book has to be really, really terrible for me to go below 3 stars. So the biggest issue that I had with this, again, is pacing in a different way than previous, like with The Hollows, book 3, because so much of this book is like exposition, info dumping, introducing so many new characters at the very beginning. Some who like, and they're all given the same weight. So that's the thing, is like, there's so many different points of view, so many different plot lines happening, very disconnected, very unclear on how they're like supposed to be connected until like the last possible second. And through all of this, it's all given such equal importance and such like equal weight that it really felt like a waste of time when it was clear that something wasn't actually that important. Because there's just so much that you're trying to remember, because this is like a massive book. There's so much you're trying to remember, and then to find out that something you spent actually like a decent amount of time investing in is just not important. And okay, I will spoil it a little bit, but like, so there's an introduction of one of the rebels who is helping steal a box from the like treasure ship. And we get like his full backstory. We find out how he gets involved with the movement. We find out like how much he like resents the way his like relationship with his father turned out, and how he hopes his father can understand. Like, there's a lot of him and his father. And then he just kind of dies. And it was both like, we're given enough that I feel like we're supposed to like invest in him, but then not so much that I actually cared about him, because it's clear that he's like a villain, or at least like helping the villains. And it was just like, so he's just dead now. So I just read all of those chapters on his backstory for no reason, when you like, you don't need that much on him. And I think that's kind of like the dark side of what Schwab is really good at, which is a positive for the book, which is that she's so good at character building. You can see how much thought she has put into every single one of these characters. But then you get instances like that where it's like, I actually didn't need to know that much about him. and I regret reading that much about him. The pacing was bad enough in this book that so I had rented it from the library on my Kindle, and I got through about half of it before my time was up, and I just kind of let the library take it, and I just re-entered the queue, and like 2 months later finally finished the book. It's not until like the last third of the book that it really picks up, and I'm willing to recognize that the last third of the book is probably just like the climax of the plot and the falling action. And that's even worse, to just recognize that it was basically just like a straight line of plot and then just like and that's like, it's just frustrating because the first trilogy was so quality that, and like I recognize, because I know a lot of people have issues with like the amount of like info dumping and world building that happens within the first trilogy, and I didn't feel that with the first one because we're like learning everything, but this time I really felt like that's exactly what happened, and that was so frustrating because it's existing in a world that we already know. There's no reason that there has to be this much world building, and it's like this much exposition, I should say, because it's just not necessary. There's no reason that I have to relearn things like this to this much detail. That being said, I'm hopeful for the next few books. It's definitely a good setup for a new series. And so I'm excited for that. I'm excited to see where like everything that we left off with in the very last little bit of the book takes us. But it just took so long to see how all of these things were connected. And so that was really heartbreaking for me. Okay. So the last one we've got here is House of Flame and Shadow. And I am going to try to keep this minimal. I'm going to try to keep my thoughts, because this is my most recent, like, finished book. So it's all very fresh. And also, I had very, very high hopes for this one. In the same, like, maybe the reason that Fragile Threads of Power and House of Flame and Shadow ended up at the bottom of the list is because I had high expectations. But I'm willing to admit that and still move forward with this. So this is by Sarah J. Maas. It's third book in the Crescent City series, which I think should have just been a trilogy. That's just me. This is only 3 stars. And the kind of key points on this, one, I don't think that this book needed to be as long as it is. I'm having more and more issues with how long people are making these books. The only reason it made marginal sense is because this is like an ensemble. And so I totally get, like, yeah, you're going to have plenty of different points of view branching off and connecting and everything. And I think this book handled it a lot better than Fragile Threads of Power did. But also, so much of it could have been like 2 books. There's no reason that it had to be like 900 pages. Okay, I will go through the positives that I've got here. So one, I think this is a really satisfying way to end the conflict with the Astari and with the Daglin. It built up a lot, and it was a big enough finale, basically, that I think it justified a lot of the length and the time that I spent on this. I also liked that the crossover was not overused. I definitely had high hopes for it, or I guess like I was overexcited for it, and it was just enough. It was like the perfect amount, kind of like al dente crossover. It was not too much, because the book is also big enough as it is. There's enough characters in this that anything more really, I don't know that this book could have taken more. I don't know that this book could have taken more characters. And that's saying something, because I love like Nesta and Asriel, and having them be the ones that were focused on in the crossover was a joy. It was like all 3 of my favorite Maas characters all together, and I was having a blast, even though I have issues with Bryce, but we will get to that in a moment. I do like that it was an ensemble style, kind of like point of views jumping everywhere, because there is so much happening, and so it definitely made it a lot easier to bring everything together afterwards. And I think, so where some books might fall into the trap of like leaving too many cliffhangers when you jump between points of view, I don't think Maas did that. I think she handled the cliffhangers pretty well, because it wasn't just like cliffhanger and then full ass chapter, like full 20-page chapter. It was like cliffhanger, small point of view, cliffhanger, and then they jump back, and they were kind of overlapping, which I enjoyed. And that way it felt more like a movie jumping between scenes than like a book with like a chapter, point of view, chapter, point of view, chapter, and you have to like wait like 50 pages to get back to somebody. Okay. So those were my like positives, and those were like my notable positives, because there was a lot of like little things, like the sex is hot, of course. I think some of my favorite characters emerged out of this book, and I know that I'm unpopular when I say this, but Ethan is one of my favorite characters. And so like Ethan and Lydia and Rune and Sathya. Like I really enjoyed getting these little, like getting more out of these characters. But part of that is because I did not like Bryce in this book. At first I thought it was just like, okay, it's just because she's in Prythian, she's kind of in enemy territory. We're not seeing her be herself in this situation. But then pretty quickly I realized that that was just not the case. My main issues with her are, one, the whole like not telling people the whole plan until the last possible second when she enacts her like secret step to the plan. That was only cute when she had trust issues in book 1 and parts of book 2. Now, like, she's explicitly called out for it in this book, and then she just does not confront it or try to fix it. She just does what she wants still, and that is just so frustrating. As like a literary device, I can understand using that at first, but it just got really annoying really quickly in this book. 2, and I know a lot of people definitely feel the same way as me on this, she was extremely rude to Hunt, given like everything that happened. And I can understand that she was concerned about ever getting back to their world. But the second she got back to their world, that was no longer a concern. But it should have been a concern that he had just like been re-traumatized by one of the worst experiences of his entire life. And every time he tries to just be like, I think we should be more careful, like he's clearly got PTSD going on, because it just repeated everything that happened to him centuries before. And she's just like, no. She's just not interested in having that conversation. She's only interested in having the conversation where she is on top. She's in charge. That was really bothersome. Extremely bothersome, because she's just like acting like a child in every single one of those conversations. And then one of my favorite things about Bryce in the first couple of books is that she very much uses people's perception of her as like a pretty curvy princess, basically. Princess in like the derogatory term, and then princess, actual princess later. She uses that against them a lot, and I like that. I like that she's willing to like weaponize that part of herself in order to challenge people. But then Sathya comes along, and she, like, for lack of a better word, invades like Bryce's harem that she's got, this like collage of men around her. And there is almost nothing positive that she says about Sathya. In her head, she's very rude to her personally, and then in her head, it's clear that she has the same assumptions about Sathya that everybody else had about Bryce. And I'm just like, that's so... it's just so, like, screwed up, first of all. But also, it makes all of the other times when I've thought that Bryce was, like, the cool person for the way she was using that, it makes all of those just, like, tainted. Which was really, really frustrating, because when Sathia is very much being like, maybe we want like a kick-ass queen to stop the men from treating us like this. Like, that is exactly what Bryce was given the opportunity to do. And she does kind of take them up on it, but she's still insisting. She's just like, no, I'm going to leave you all. And it's like, okay, that's not actually helpful, though. If you want to, like, you have the opportunity to change the culture, and instead you're just going to, like, complain about it. That was not the vibe for me. Did not like that at all. And that was, like, the big overarching issue that I had with the book. So the reason that I like the ensemble is because I don't have to read everything from Bryce's point of view, from her being really shitty to Hunt and to Sathia and to some of her friends. But also, like, this is more an issue with Maas's, I guess, or like Maas's use of certain events. So much like where, like, she introduces mates and it's like, oh, mates are so rare, and then everybody gets a mate. Everybody gets a mate. Now, I just don't feel anything if a character dies in her books, because I know there's like a 97% chance they're going to be brought back from the dead. It doesn't carry any of the weight. So when she was like drifting through space into a black hole, I was like, well, she's going to be fine. I actually don't doubt for a second that she's going to be fine. And it takes a lot of the weight out of those instances. Because again, I think the closing out of the Asteri issue was solid, but the fact that I was supposed to believe Bryce was gonna die, just, it didn't work. It didn't happen. I didn't for a second believe that Bryce was dying. And even when she did die, I was like, I don't believe this either. One, there's too much book left. But two, we've seen it with Rhysand, we've seen it with Feyre. I mean, we kind of saw it with Nesta. There's no part of me that thought, wow, this is the end for Bryce. This is her paradise. Like, no, I didn't think that's what was happening at all. So yeah, I was really disappointed in the way that Bryce was characterized in this book, and it just kind of, as much as it was nice to like engage with the other characters, I just did not care enough about Bryce to really be invested in where she was going afterwards. So back to my comment earlier, I think / wish that this were the end of the series. From what I understand, she's kind of got plans for book 4, but I don't think that more, like, I think this is just such a succinct ending. You've got like the hope of the Phalanx getting their magic back, and the Asteri are gone, and there's the kind of like the potential for a new age. But now, like, it's the hope of a new age doesn't exist if you know that there's going to be a new book, and there's almost certainly going to be conflict with that. And there's so many loose ends that are open that I'm just like, we don't have to do that, though. We don't have to get into it, do we? We should just not get into it. That'd be so much fun. Thanks. Yeah. So I was significantly let down by this book, which is really frustrating. Part of me is glad that there's not another, like, Maasverse book coming out anytime soon, so I don't have to invest this much time and energy into it if this is going to be the payoff. But yeah, so that is the books that I've read recently, in order of most to least rated, not favorite, rated. If you guys have any suggestions for books I should read next based on my ratings here, then please pop them into the comments, or feel free to email me at inbedwithbookspodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I hope you all have a pleasant rest of your week, and happy reading. Thank you for joining me for another episode of In Bed with Books, a bookish podcast for bookish babes. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all of the latest updates. And if you have any suggestions for authors, books, or topics that you want to hear about on the podcast, then feel free to DM me on Instagram or shoot me an email. I'm wishing you a lovely rest of your day, and until next time, happy reading.